Question. Hi Kim. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on the initiation that comes at the 96th level when moving from the outer aspects of Christhood to the inner levels, moving forwards on the path of Christhood. I can see that I have hit this juncture lifetime after lifetimes, and what happens after a time is that I suddenly begin a rapid descent down in consciousness. It does not take too long to move back up again, but the descent is like sinking into quicksand. Everything becomes dark and dense so quickly. I had even developed a self that believed it had significant Christic attainment, and this would make me blind to the pattern at the 96th juncture. Finally, I see that I am ready and willing at this turning point, after a rapid awakening to this pattern. I am feeling open and in a beautiful space of innocence, ready to begin expressing my Christhood. There is just one thing I am noticing, and I think it is linked with this initiation at the 96th level. I seem to be obsessing more than before about a fear of the future, mainly worrying about security, finances, a home, etc. Do you think this is a self that is linked with fearing expressing my Christhood, trying to avoid this initiation again? I would greatly appreciate your insights about this initiation. Any of your experiences and perspectives would be greatly valued. Well, just to give a little background, the Ascended Masters have given these teachings that there are 144 levels of consciousness on Earth, possible levels of consciousness. And we start at the 48th level, where we have a certain sense of connection to our higher self and the Ascended Masters. Then we can choose to go below the 48th level, where we go into these levels of separation and based on the duality consciousness. And most of us have done that in past lifetimes, and then we usually come to a point, we don't have to go to the very lowest level, but we come to a point where we turn around and start walking up again. And then when we reach the 48th level, we can walk the path that the Masters have described. They have a series of 7 books called The Path to Self-Mastery. And they're all named with the mystical the mystical initiations of power, the mystical initiations of wisdom, love, and so on. So you are climbing from the 48th to the 96th level. And what the Masters are describing is that Earth is an unnatural planet, has a very dense collective consciousness that pulls us down, that does not want us to rise above the average person, whatever that means in our society. You are a normal person. You're supposed to be a normal person. And walking the spiritual path is not normal. So really, between the 48th and 96th level, you have to raise yourself above the pull from the collective consciousness and even darker forces. So you're building a self as you're climbing. You're building a self, a sense of self as a spiritual person, as a spiritual self. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is absolutely necessary. In order to raise ourselves above the pull of the collective consciousness, we have to build this self. Nothing wrong with it. Completely natural on an unnatural planet. But then when we hit the 96th level, this is at the 96th level, when you go above that, you start going into the levels of personal Christhood. Below that, you're not at the level of Christhood. It's only when you go above it. So at the 96th level, and it's not like it's one big thing right there. You can start passing that initiation before you reach the 96th level by understanding the dynamic. But at the 96th level, you will face this initiation of what are you going to do now. And what you basically need to do is you need to recognize that climbing from the 48th to the 96th level was a normal, natural stage on your spiritual path. And it was normal and natural that you built this self. But this self was like the booster on a rocket that was only meant to take you up to a certain altitude. And then what does the rocket do? Well, it divides itself and the booster just falls back to Earth and the rocket can then rise higher. Which basically means that this self that you built to get to the 96th level is no longer necessary. In fact, it's not even constructive because it won't take you higher. So it needs to die. Just like I talk about all these separate selves that we need to let die. And Jesus described this in his initiation, in his teachings 2,000 years ago, where he's talking about he who seeks to save his life shall lose it. In other words, saving the life that brought you to the 96 level. It doesn't apply just to that. You basically, at every level of the path, there's a self that has to die, but especially at the 96 level. And so he also said, he who is willing to lose his life for my sake shall find eternal life. And it's really not a teaching you find a lot out there. All of my years on the spiritual path, don't really remember it being described as clearly as the Masters describe it with the 144 levels of consciousness. So a lot of people, I think, don't really grasp this, the importance of letting that self die. And you know, the person is describing here that I can see that I've hit this juncture lifetime after lifetime, and what happens after a time is that I suddenly begin a rapid descent down in consciousness. It's like sinking into quicksand. Everything becomes dark and dense so quickly. You know, this is because when you are at that level, it's sort of an all or nothing choice. Either you let the self die or you cling to it. And there are people who can go into, they actually think that they have to just continue to develop that self so it becomes so spiritual that God simply has to let it into heaven. It's like making a certain bargain with God. There are also people who are just afraid to let go of it because they're afraid of what's going to come after. And it sounds a little bit like the person asking the question is at that point of being afraid to let go of it because what comes after. That's why it feels like a descent into quicksand. Everything becomes dark and dense so quickly. I mean, who am I if I don't have this spiritual self? But the thing is, once you really let the self die, you will see who you are because you have climbed to a much higher level. But if you don't let the self die, you can't see it. That's the importance of this teaching that the Masters have given about the separate self. So they're saying, at the 48th level of consciousness, we have a separate self that's based on a particular illusion. When we come to see that illusion, see that the separate self is based on illusion, and see the higher reality, we can voluntarily and consciously let that self die, then we rise to the 49th. And if we keep doing that from the 48th to the 96th level, we build a momentum on letting these selves die. So it isn't such a big deal to let that spiritual self die that we have built. But if you don't really grasp that process consciously, then when you get to the 48th level, it feels like, oh, this is really, really significant. When you get to the 96th level, I mean, this is a big self that you can't just let go of, because it's a spiritual self, and you needed it, which you did, but you only needed it to get to the 96th level. So what I would say is that, from my personal experience, I was going through this initiation up through the 1990s, and I really passed it in 2002 when I started working with the Ascended Masters. And what happened was that, first of all, I started working on my psychology in the early 1990s, and for several years I was really working on that, various forms of therapy. But I also grasped this concept of surrender, that you need to surrender. And then at the same time, I grasped this concept of non-attachment that the Buddha taught, that you need to reach a state of non-attachment. And those two things together helped me see that I didn't have the concept back then of separate selves, but I could see that the spiritual path is a process of constant surrender of your attachments. Because the attachment is coming from a separate self that's based on an illusion. It makes you think, oh, this is very important to me to hold on to this. And when you see that it is not important, you can surrender. You can let it go. So, for example, you have built, possibly over many lifetimes, a spiritual sense of self, that you are a spiritual person because whatever criteria you have. You've done these outer things, you have given all these decrees, you have, like the person is actually describing here, I had even developed a self that believed it had significant Christic attainment, and this would make me blind to the pattern at the 96th juncture. So the spiritual self, just depending on what teachings it finds, it can build this sense that it has Christic attainment. And it has attainment, but not Christic attainment. Because Christ is really, when you consciously see that Christhood requires you to reach a distinctly higher state of consciousness, and you can only reach that by letting your sense of self that you have right now, letting it die. It's really the only way. You have to let the sense of self you have right now at the 96th level, you have to let it die. And what came to me in the last few years there, before I really had that experience, was that I became more and more aware that as a result of finding the Summit Lighthouse and being a very eager student and giving all these hours and hours of decrees, that I had built this kind of a self that thought it had a certain attainment on the path. And I thought this was very, very important that I did this. And I gradually started questioning this and surrendering it more and more, and realizing, what I basically realized is that my outer attainment on the path, all the outer things I had done, really didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was my state of consciousness. And my state of consciousness was a matter of, what had I surrendered? What had I let go of? What have I allowed to die? And as a result of that, there came a point, and I've described it before, that I had this experience. I've been sitting in my office decree room, and I've been giving some decrees, and all of a sudden I felt like, it was almost like I was outside of my body. But I just looked at myself, I looked at my state of consciousness from the outside, I looked at my history on the spiritual path up through the 80s and 90s, and all of a sudden I saw that everything I had done, how to put it? I mean, I'm tempted to say that it didn't matter. It didn't make any difference. It was just vanity. But it wasn't. I mean, what I had done was necessary to bring me to that point. But what I saw was, all of these things I had done wasn't going to take me to the next level. It just didn't matter. And all of this sense that, and really here is, I think, what was the core of it, was that I had this sense, because it was very prevalent in the Summit Lighthouse, and it is in many spiritual movements, that by doing all these outer things, I was like, I was earning points with the masters. It's like I was making this bargain with the masters, you know. Look, I did all of this, I gave all these services, I decreed for 4 hours. So it was like I had gained merit. I had earned something, and the masters were obligated to let me into the kingdom of God because I'd done all these other things here on earth. And what I saw in that experience was this: nothing I could possibly ever do on earth would get me into the kingdom of heaven. No other thing whatsoever. Whether I was a good Catholic who believed in the doctrines, who went to Mass every Sunday, who lit candles to Mother Mary, or whether I was a good Ascended Master student who gave hours and hours of decrees, all of this, it wasn't going to get me into the kingdom. I could not earn my way, I couldn't buy my way, I couldn't force my way, I couldn't fool my way. Nothing would fool the Ascended Masters. And that's what I saw in one glaring realization. Nothing would fool the Masters. They would only look at one thing, my state of consciousness, and nothing else. And when I saw that, I just spontaneously, because I saw the illusion and the reality behind it, I just let go of that self. I just let it go, because I realized I wanted to go higher on the path. I wanted to go higher. And in order to go higher, I saw I had to let go of this baggage. And I understand very well that's what the person is saying here, that I've hit this juncture lifetime after lifetime, and after a time I suddenly begin a rapid descent down in consciousness. That's because you are afraid to let go. You're afraid to let go of that self. We could say it's also a self that's very focused on itself, because it thinks, as the person describes, I had even developed a self that believed it had significant Christic attainment. So this self to rebuild in order to get to the 96th level, it's based on this idea, as I said, that you're doing all these outer things right, and this earns you points. And if we have based it on that, which is very common because it's what I call the outer path, and most spiritual movements are based on this idea that by doing something, whether it's meditation or decrees or whatever, you're earning points. And if you have a certain amount of points, it's like you get there, and let's just illustrate it. You think, as you're walking from the 48th to the 96th level, you are ascending a spiral staircase. And at the top of the staircase, there's an ascended master, and there's the doorway into the ascended realm. And you think that when you get there, you can look back at your path and you can say, but look, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this. All of this stuff I've done for you. I did all these decrees to bring in the golden age of Saint Germain. I did all of this. You got to let me in. I've earned it. And then you have to come to that realization that, no, what you did helped you climb to that level. But what you did on earth and what you did up until that point has absolutely nothing to do with getting into the kingdom. Nothing whatsoever. You haven't earned any points. The Ascended Masters, God, they don't owe you anything, no matter what you have done. So basically, what I realized is that what I had done up to this point was all a matter of the transformation of my consciousness. It didn't earn me any points for getting into the spiritual realm. But if I had transformed my consciousness enough, if I had separated myself from this self, then I could let the self die. But I had to let it die. I was the one who had to let it die. Let the dead bury their dead and follow Christ. And if you haven't really grasped that with a conscious mind, then I can see why you could be scared of letting the self die, because what would be there instead? And this also probably could cause this, as the person says, I seem to be obsessing more and more about the fear of the future, mainly worrying about security, finances, a home, etc. And I think it is linked to that. Let's put it this way. You are climbing, you are walking these steps up the spiral staircase towards the 96th level. And you are thinking that based on what you are doing, you are building security. Because again, as I said, you are earning points. And if you have a certain amount of points, they have to let you in. And when you get to that point where you have to let go of the self, you are afraid, but then I'm letting go of all this sense of security. And that is very, very true. I mean, when I faced this situation I'm describing there, I was literally sitting there, I was seeing the vanity, the unreality of thinking I could earn my way into heaven. And I had no idea what would be left of me if I let that go. I really didn't know. I honestly didn't know. But I was at the point where I just let it go. And then, of course, there was a certain sense of self that I could build on, and it was a much more detached and peaceful sense of self that I had before, so I could go right on with my path. But you had to let it die. You have to really let it die without knowing what comes after. And as I said, if you had prepared, then it wouldn't be such a hard choice. But if you haven't understood this mechanism, then you might actually be attached to this self and cling to the self, and it might feel like too big of a loss, too big of a risk to let it die. And I can understand that. I don't know if I can help you with it other than what I've said. That when you come to understand it, when you come to really see that, it was just to get you to that point. You could say that the purpose of building this spiritual self that thinks it has Christic attainment and think it's an advanced spiritual student, it was to bring you to the point where you had the choice to let it go. Because see, when you're at the 87th level of consciousness, you can't let that self go. You're not there yet. You have to build on the self until you reach the 96th level. And then at that level, you have the option to let it go. Before that, you can't let it go. But you can, of course, come to consciously understand the need to let it go. So it isn't such a hard choice. It doesn't seem like such an all-or-nothing, scary choice to make. And in a sense, I would say it's probably the most crucial turning point on the spiritual path. Because if you don't grasp that initiation, you can very easily, you don't let that spiritual self die, you keep building on it. And you think you're making progress on the spiritual path, but you're not. You cannot go beyond the 96th level until you let that self die. And then what you will do is you will stand there for a while, and gradually you will start going down, because now you're seeking to use your attainment in this world, what you're doing in this world, or even teachings, to validate the self and validate why you are not letting it die. And that will take you down. And it will, depending on your individual psychology, it can feel like the person describing is sinking into quicksand. Because in a sense you could say that you have some awareness that you didn't let it go. And that something is missing there. Something happened that ideally shouldn't have happened. And in order to avoid looking at that, you go down in consciousness. And I have seen people literally who, and this of course can happen at any moment between the 48th and 96th level, that people come to something they won't surrender. So I've seen people, they came to a point where there was something they wouldn't surrender, and they just started going down. And all of a sudden they became very, very focused on themselves. They created this entire drama around themselves. And I think this is what happens. I have a whole playlist about ego dramas. And I talk about the epic mindset. And I think what happens when you have a person who has walked the spiritual path for a while, person may not be at the 96th level, but it comes to a point between the 48th and the 96th where there's something it won't surrender. And it's usually this sense of self, the spiritual sense of self that you built, that thinks it has attainment on the path, right? And so the person won't surrender this. And now they become very focused on validating the self, reinforcing the self, and they can, in order to do this, they can create in their minds this sense of drama, that they are so important, they have a special mission. And I've seen people do this, where they had a special mission, they were the only ones who could do this for the Ascended Masters, or whatever it may be. You know, it can even be personal things, like a big drama about somebody getting divorced, or somebody's house burning down, or whatever it may be. But you're assigning some kind of cosmic importance to your little affairs here on earth. And basically what I saw with that initiation I'm talking about, where I looked at it and I saw that all of the things I had done meant nothing. And what I really saw was that I meant nothing. I wasn't important whatsoever. You know, all of the years I've been in spiritual movements, especially in the Summit Lighthouse and the Ascended Masters, I thought that, oh, it was important that I personally found the path of the Ascended Masters, because there are not so many people finding it. And I, along with the other few thousand people in the summit, we were giving all these decrees to save the world for Saint Germain, and it was epically important that we did this. So I also thought I had built some kind of attainment, some kind of merit, and that I was important. And all of a sudden I saw, no, I the self that I saw myself as, the spiritual self, it's not important at all. It doesn't matter whatsoever. It's not making any difference. Now you have to see this with a little bit of a discernment here, because I'm not saying it was a waste of time what I did. Right? It did help the planet that we gave all these decrees to transform the energy. So I'm not saying it didn't make a difference, but what I saw was that this self that I had built could not get into heaven, no matter what it thought about itself. So its own self-image was completely out of touch with reality. And it's this really, it's like all of the illusions fall away, the scales fall from your eyes, all of these imagined things of how important you are and how the Ascended Masters look at you. You realize, yes, the Ascended Masters thinks every person is important. They want to help all of us. They love all of us unconditionally. But they don't love the outer self. They love who you really are. And you are not the self. Like I've said so many times, the conscious you has created the self, hasn't become the self. But as long as you are looking at yourself through the filter of the self, you think you're important. And that's what fell away. The scales fell from my eyes. I saw, oh, it meant nothing. It could not get into heaven. And it just had to go. It had to be let die. I had to let it die. And it was a conscious choice. It was a conscious surrender. And it really was this, it wasn't a negative for me. You understand? It's not like I felt, oh, I'm so bad, I'm such an idiot for believing I could force myself into heaven. It was just, I saw the illusion, I let it go. But I saw the illusion, I saw how absolutely insignificant the outer self was. It absolutely meant nothing compared to the spiritual realm, because in the ascended realm, there's no room for this. And I experienced, the Ascended Masters, they love us unconditionally. But they are absolutely immovable to this outer self that thinks it can somehow earn its place in heaven, cheat its way into heaven, force its way into heaven. They're completely immovable. And when I accepted that, I could see the vanity of the self. I could just let it all go. And that took me to a higher level, not the highest level, but a much higher level of the path where I could start working on myself in a different way, where I wasn't trying to find excuses anymore. Wasn't trying to hide anything from the Masters. Before that, this self that thinks it has merit is always trying to hide something, right? And it's not a way to describe it. It's it's in a sense, it's building an image, and it's trying to hide that the image is just an image. It's not reality. And so, in a sense, it may have a sense, I have some unresolved psychology, but I want to gloss that over because I think that if I don't look at it, the Masters don't see it. And that's what I also realized. The Masters see everything. You can't hide anything from your Ascended Masters. That's why you can't cheat your way into heaven. You come there and you have this unresolved psychology, these subconscious selves, hidden away in your subconscious mind, and you think the Masters aren't going to see it, but they see everything. They don't judge us. They don't condemn us. They just see it, and they see you're not ready. You can't get in. And there's no two ways about it. There's no arguing about it. Either you're ready or you're not ready. But if you're not ready, it's because there's something you haven't seen and you haven't surrendered, you haven't let some self die. And so I think that's what's coming to me for now. And maybe, obviously, there could be other things, but then ask me some more specific questions about it.